Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on restorative justice implementation, restorative justice champions, the role of school and district level coordinators. My name is Dewana Nicole, and I'm with Advancement Project, one of the 5 organizations that represent the Restorative Justice Partnership. The others are the National Education Association, Denver Public Schools, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, and Padres y Jóvenes Unidos. I'm so excited to be joined today by Allison Meyer, who's the Restorative Practices Coordinator for Denver Public Schools, and Allison Horton, who's the Restorative Practices Coordinator for Skinner Middle School. Before we begin, Allison has an opening for us.
This is a combination of 2 quotes from Nelson Mandela. It is better to lead from behind and to put others in front, especially when you celebrate victory when nice things occur. You take the front line when there is danger, then people will appreciate your leadership. A leader is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the other follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind.
Thank you for that. So just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. After tonight, we will send out the recording of the webinar and any materials and resources referenced during the webinar to everyone who signed up in about a week. You can also find a copy of our previous webinars on our website, rjpartnership.org. Just a reminder, and especially for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. You can type in your question in the question box at any point during the presentation if you are joining over computer or smartphone. Unfortunately, if you are only calling in, I do not have a way of unmuting your line to take your question. However, you can send me an email to dnicole@advancementproject.org, and I will be able to read your question. And for those of you who know me personally who are joining us, you can always send me a text message and I can get your question answered that way. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison Horton.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just to introduce myself, I am the Restorative Practice Coordinator at Skinner Middle School in Denver, Colorado. We serve about 630 students. My journey to this role started in 7th grade. My social studies teacher in 7th grade played us the movie Gandhi. In retrospect, I realized that that's a 3-hour movie, so I'm not quite sure what was going on with lesson planning, but it turned out to be really impactful to me. I became fascinated with the idea of peace and nonviolence and Gandhi, which led me to study peace and conflict in college at Appalachian State in Boone, North Carolina. I had visions of heading to the United Nations eventually, but one summer after my junior year, I desperately needed a job, and so I had a job at with the organization Upward Bound at Appalachian State, where I worked with high school students and realized that became a big part of my passion and that I really felt most impactful and most alive when I was working with young people. And so after I graduated from college and worked 2 summers with Upward Bound, I Googled youth and restorative practices, and Denver Public Schools came up. And so because of Google, I found out about Denver Public Schools and their implementation of restorative justice in the schools, and moved to Denver, Colorado from Memphis, Tennessee, and started working at North as a restorative paraprofessional. And then a year later, moved to split my time and moved to Skinner, and have been at Skinner for 5 years as the Restorative Practices Coordinator. My favorite part about being a Restorative Practice Coordinator is definitely still those more formal restoratives with teachers and students. Even just today, I had one where a social studies teacher and a student in 7th grade just have not been seeing eye to eye, a lot of just kind of off-task behavior with the teacher trying to connect. And he took a moment to tell the student, like, I can tell you think I'm picking on you. I can tell you think, like, you know, it's really, you know, a lot of other people are doing it, but you're getting the redirections, and I want to apologize to that. I'm just seeing sometimes that's how it goes, and you're the person I see or hear. And then he took the opportunity to tell the student how much he cares about the student and that student's success. And you just see this softening when students hear adults modeling responsibility, modeling apologizing, and asking for forgiveness, and just being really human with one another. And so those are still my favorite moments of the job, is when adults and students can really come together and work things out and just be human with one another.
That's so sweet. My name is Allison Meyer, and I'm the Restorative Practices District Coordinator. And so I have the pleasure of supporting people like Allison Horton, who are in our school buildings. I discovered this work as a classroom teacher. I was teaching in a high school social studies classroom in Chicago. I was at a small charter school on the Northwest side, and was eventually made to be a mentor teacher for new teachers. I was in my 4th year, which is probably a pretty inappropriate time for you to be mentoring new teachers. And I was supporting a colleague of mine who was frequently sending students out of the classroom down to our discipline office. And it was her first year, and first-year teachers who showed a pattern of doing that had traditionally not been renewed for the following school year. And so we were looking online for different strategies that she might use to keep students in her classrooms. And I discovered restorative practices. And it was one of those revelations where you realize this is something I've already been doing, and I didn't know there was a name for it, and also a better structure for it and more intentional tools that I might use. And so my favorite part about being a restorative practices coordinator is supporting those educators that are in classrooms. I often felt unsupported in building relationships. I would frequently be praised by administrators for the rapport I had with students, but there was never any intentional professional development around how you actually build those relationships and what to do if you're struggling building a relationship with a certain student. And so I like that my work not only impacts students, but also helps keep really high quality educators in classrooms across Denver. And so we're going to kind of walk through the difference between our two roles and some of the similarities as well, because there certainly are a lot of similarities. And Allison Horton will speak to what happens at that school-based level, and I'll be doing a lot of speaking to what happens at the district level. But in both of our roles, you'll see that what we do really falls into 2 or 3 major buckets. Originally in our district, I think we saw a lot of what we do being just that intervention bucket. And so using a conferencing model and occasionally harm circles, when Denver Public Schools first started implementing restorative practices, restorative justice, they were very focused on a conferencing model. I would say in the last couple of years, we've really started to embed circle practice into the way that we implement across schools. But we saw a lot of times our restorative practices coordinators in schools were running around from one fire to the next and putting out fires and only responding to incidents. And often treated as almost like diversion programs. And so instead of suspension, I will send the student down to the restorative office, and they will have a restorative conversation, and then we will plug them back into the classroom. And frequently the classroom teachers were not involved in those conversations at all. And so we're really starting to build out how we define that role, so that to help support our coordinators and so that they don't fall into that intervention only place. And so other things that fall into that intervention category that we know that our coordinators are doing in buildings are following up on previous incidents and tracking the use of restorative justice practices as an intervention. And so trying to do a lot of data collection so we can argue for why their job should continue to exist and why they are valuable human beings in our district. We ask our coordinators to also focus their time on prevention. And so that means relationship building, just being generally present in areas around the school, both the areas that are kind of those hotspots and just to be present even when things are going well, and really defining what it means to be a restorative school and celebrating those folks who are upholding that definition. I think one thing that's newer this year or in the last probably year and a half that we're really trying to support both at the district and the school level is that restorative practices coordinators are drivers of school culture. And what that means for us is that you are constantly modeling restorative culture for the different stakeholders in your building, and then primarily that you are building capacity in others. And so frequently, restorative practices was just seen as one person's job, both at the district level and at the school level. And what we want to build out is that educators and students and families across our schools see that I am actually responsible for being restorative and for building restorative practices as well. And to do so, we need to be constantly modeling and training folks in all of our different places. And then lastly, we really want our restorative practices coordinators, and both at the district and school level, to be seen as leaders in the district. I think so often that work is really compartmentalized. And so sometimes we're in schools where our schools are still learning what that role looks like, and how to really treat that role as a valuable leadership role. And so making sure that those coordinators are in the meetings that they need to be in, and on the teams that they need to be on in order to effectively drive school culture. One thing I will make sure that we share with you after this webinar is our district has developed a rubric that can be used as a coaching tool for our coordinators, and it divides the different practices that we want to see our coordinators doing into those 3 buckets. And one thing I'll note that we did very intentionally was the order that we put those things on their coaching tool. We put school culture and climate and driving that school culture and climate first. Then we put prevention, and then we put intervention. The goal being that if you prioritize those other 2 pieces, our coordinators, both at the district and school level, will spend a lot less time running around buildings putting out fires. And so we actually recently had a meeting of our coordinators from across the district, and one activity we did was have people draw a pie chart about how they feel like they currently divide their time between these 3 buckets, and then a goal pie chart for how they hope to move forward in the future. As a district, we try to model 33% for each one, a third, a third, a third, knowing that some of our schools that are newer, you might see more of that like 50, 60% intervention in those first couple of years, and you can start to work to more prevention and school culture. Just as important as what we do is what we don't do. And so I'm going to send it off to Allison Horton to talk a little bit about at the school level what she very much tries not to do.
Yes, so at Skinner, we try to make sure we're not just waiting for problems to arise. At the beginning of the year, when we're still in the honeymoon phase of kids coming back excited for school and what the new year brings us, we're making sure we're pushing into classrooms as much as possible, and not just sitting in our offices waiting for those radio calls to come in or waiting for something to happen. We're always trying to push to be working on our school community building and those prevention strategies that we have. We also want to make sure, as a restorative practices coordinator, we don't want to be the only person a student has a relationship within the building. So oftentimes I'll ask students, you know, who's their favorite teacher, or what other adults in the building do they feel comfortable with, and trying to get that thermostat of making sure that we're all building relationships with our students, because that also leads to the next thing, which is we don't want the support staff office, so we don't want to restore practices coordinator's office to be an escape room of getting out of the struggle of, you know, if academics are difficult, we don't want them to just escape to come get support from us, but that we are providing support within the classroom and coming to the students as much as possible, and building relationships and making sure that the teachers and other staff members are doing so as well. We also want to try as best we can. Skinner, the foundation of everything we do here is restorative. So our deans deal with the discipline issues, but so do restorative practices coordinators, because they are leading restorative work as well as us. But there are some things that we want to make sure we're staying in our lane. So if there are things like drugs or sexual harassment, or things that a dean or a social worker or community a CSO or a community security officer need to be leading, that they're really starting off there, and then we make sure we have that restorative piece included, but trying to stay in our lane so that we can be spending our time creating that community culture in the building, and again having the time to work on preventative measures so we're not just firefighters in the building.
At the district level, one thing I should note is we are very fortunate in Denver Public Schools to have 2 district level coordinators. And so this position has evolved a little bit over the last 15 years. But one thing we try really hard not to do is we get a lot of phone calls from schools, and we don't want to just come out and respond to a one-time incident in a school without doing a couple of the following things. And so one thing I always make sure I do if I'm called out to a school is I need to be building capacity within your existing team. And so, for example, if I'm asked to come out to a building to keep a harm circle, I'm going to ask that somebody from that building also participate as well, because I leave and those relationships need to stay within those building, and that level of accountability and follow-up needs to stay there as well. A lot of times we'll also make sure that we're providing feedback around systems and how those align with restorative practices implementation. One example I can give is some of our schools are very well intentioned and develop systems that make it really easy for staff to refer students to their discipline or restorative offices. And sometimes they've inadvertently developed a system that just makes it so easy to refer students that everything starts being referred outside the classroom. And so a lot of times I'll take the opportunity of being invited into a building and leverage that into a conversation to give feedback around restorative practices implementation. I also very much try not to compromise the fidelity of practice to meet the needs and timelines of budgets of our schools or other departments within our school district. And so an example I can give is sometimes you get called out to a school and they want a quick fix. We have these 2, this family and this family, or these 2 students or this student and teacher, and we need them back in the class immediately, but really pushing back to help them understand our process and understand why being patient and actually going through all of these various steps that sometimes are very time consuming, it takes time. And so I would say we get that a lot with restorative conferences or harm circles where people want a really quick and immediate fix. I would say also I sometimes see I have to be really careful when I'm invited into trainings. Sometimes the amount of time I'm given to train staff, and even just one strategy, is so short that I cannot actually train your staff in this strategy and have them and trust that they have the tools that they need to be able to implement it. And so that is probably one of my least favorite parts of the job, is pushing back on administrators around that. We try really hard not to go in and to only build capacity in responsive strategies and not also build capacity in proactive restorative practices. And so a lot of times I'll be asked to go out to a school that there are 210 schools in Denver Public Schools. And so I'll be called out to a building that neither myself nor Tim, my counterpart in the district, have ever been out to before to facilitate training. And they'll immediately want, so what are some strategies that teachers can use when students, and they'll use the word misbehave in the classroom. And so for me, I will push back on schools and say, like, first, let me come out and start to teach some relational exercises and activities that your classroom teachers can use, because we cannot restore something that never existed. And then finally, I try not to be confused as a building staff member. Our buildings have the option of hiring a restorative practices coordinator out of their building budgets. And some of our buildings choose not to hire an Allison Horton, an insight coordinator. And so sometimes they'll reach out to me once and I'll come out and support around some conflict that's happening in their building. And then they'll reach out to me again and again. And so helping with our buildings so that they don't see us as an extension of their staff, but rather start to see, like, this is worth us investing our own budget money in. And we should actually hire our own on-site coordinator that knows our students and knows our staff and knows what it's like to be at our school.
So this is a question I get most often, is what is a typical day in the life or week in the life of a restorative practices coordinator at Skinner Middle School? There is a lot, and luckily, as we talked about, we're really trying to push prevention and building school culture, especially as the school year is kicking off, but throughout the school year, and most of the things that our RPC does here at Skinner fits into that category. The morning starts off every support staff. So when I say support staff at Skinner, that means that we have 2 deans, 2 restorative practice coordinators, and a school social worker. We also have 2 social work interns. So out of that core 5 support staff team of the deans, the RPCs, and the social worker, we all have a morning duty where we are at at the building entrances where students are coming in, or in the cafeteria where students are eating their breakfast. We are each aligned to a grade level. And I'll talk about that in terms of meetings and going to grade level meetings. So I start off my day every morning with the 7th grade door, greeting kids, checking in with kids, of course, as a supervision and like safety role. But more importantly, having those moments to compliment new haircuts, to check in with kids about anything different going on, to check about grades, to check about the score of the softball game from last night. Utilizing that time to really build those connections where they feel happy and safe coming into the starting their school day. New this year at Skinner, we have a Restorative Justice League, which is a student-led restorative practices group of 7 students who were selected based off of an application, a teacher recommendation, and an interviewing process. There will actually be a webinar that details a lot more about the Restorative Justice League here at Skinner in January. But they are the group that myself and the other RPC, Mr. Ventresca, oversee in Learning Family, which is our version of homeroom. The wording we use here at Skinner is very intentional, so we call it Learning Family because we really see everyone in the building as a family member here at Skinner. And so we have those 15 minutes to check in with each other, to problem solve anything, to talk about any announcements. We also get the overhead announcements from our principal and from students that lead those morning announcements to kick off our day. Then we are pushing into classrooms every chance we get, not because we got a radio call that we need to be there, but really visiting and making it a normal thing for our presence to be inside a classroom, to just be there and be learning with the students and interacting and checking in with teachers. We have a 1-month rule here at Skinner that we decided on a couple years ago, where the first month of school, no student is sent out of a classroom. Of course, unless there was a big safety concern, but otherwise everything is handled in class. That's something we try to have all year long, of course, but we want to really push for the first month of school that students learn that like we want them in the classroom. Their teachers want them in the classroom. They're there to learn and be part of the learning community. And so if there's any sort of issue, then we would, the teacher can dial 0 for support. So a support staff member can come to the classroom and help support, but that we're pushing into the classroom instead of pushing kids out. So that's an intervention setting, but for the prevention side of things, we just will go into classrooms, make sure that we're seen. So then if we are coming in later, in an intervention way, then it's not a, ooh, look someone's getting in trouble. Oh, Miss Horton's here. So that means something is going down, that it's a very normal thing for any support staff member to be inside the classroom, sitting in and being present. We also have several meetings that happen on a weekly basis. We kick off the week with a weekly admin meeting where our admin, who is our principal and our assistant principal, as well as our building manager, our CSO, so the campus security officer, a representative from the front office staff, and then the support staff team all gather to go over our calendar for the week so that we're all on the same page of what's happening in our building and any meetings or things that we need to be aware of. And then after that, we meet with admin and support staff to just be on the same page about what's going on. If there are any concerns we're noticing or celebrations to notice of what's going on with students or staff, or any sort of processes that we have going on, rituals and routines that we need to sharpen up. So we meet on Monday, and then on Tuesdays, we have our grade level meetings. So those are the support staff team is divided among the grade levels. At Skinner Middle School, we're a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade middle school. And then we have a team of Core Plus, which is our elective classes. So things like woodshop, home ec, gym, Spanish, and art. And so I am with the 7th grade level because last year I was with our 6th grade team. So we follow our kids so that we can have the most information of what interventions have worked in the past, the building relationships with the families, so that those can continue to grow. But each support staff member is with a grade level team and goes to the grade level meetings. Those meetings are typically set up where it's business first, like any sort of events coming up, field trips, any information, all the grade level teachers would need to know, and then moves into those student concerns where we talk about any sort of student concerns we have of whether it's academic, attendance, or behavior, and always try to be solution oriented and offering any information we have of like what's going on in the student's life, or what we know from previous history with the student if we had them the prior year. And so we have those meetings. And then the third meeting we have on a weekly basis, so that following day is our support staff, where again, our support staff team is the 2 deans, the 2 RPCs, and our social worker meet to bring back any information from our grade level team meetings. So the idea between these 3 meetings are not that we just talk about things 3 times in a row. It's that it's a continuous communication loop so that all levels of all teams are aware of kind of what's going on, and we're all on the same page about things, and we're being really creative and proactive in trying to solve any issues that are coming up, and making sure that information is then getting out to everyone that needs the information. Another role as a restorative practices coordinator here at Skinner is that every support staff member has lunch duty 1 day a week. We use that time much like morning duty, where it's a wonderful time to check in with students, to see how their day is going, to play sports with students at recess, not just like standing there and talking to staff members, but really interacting with the students in a non-academic setting to build those relationships. We have lunch duty where we have to go 1 day a week, but oftentimes if we are free and it's lunchtime, you'll see support staff choosing to go down to lunches to have that interaction time with the students. We also do check-ins with students of just pulling kids in as just checking in if we know they might have had something go on at the home, or if their academics are off, just trying to be as proactive as possible of checking in, even if they're just kind of looking a little off and we're noticing, or if someone gave us a heads up that like something might be off with the student, to pull them in and check in with them to see if we can offer any support or find the right support for them. Every passing period, we have about 630 students, and we have common passing times. So when the bell rings, we all have a hallway duty spot that again helps create a safe place for students to pass when they see adults. Every teacher in the building as well is going to be at their doors, greeting kids, monitoring the hallways, using that time to check in and just be a friendly face. Support staff does that as well, and we spread out throughout the building in those areas that don't have many classrooms, so don't have as many adult eyes to be there in the hallway. It's a great time to come up with new handshakes for kids. It's a great time to comment on new shoes and really give students a smile as they're going to their next class. As I mentioned, we have Restorative Justice League this year. It's our first year kicking off the student-led restorative work. We really saw that. We've had restorative site visits here at Skinner for the last couple of years and had a student panel during that time, and realized that there was a lot of strength as students were speaking to their experience with the restorative practices, realizing that there was a lot of strength and skills that our students were learning, but that there was a missed opportunity to really highlight that from peer-to-peer restorative practices. So that was created last year with the help of our Restorative Justice Partnership, the manager, Miss Lindsay Lee, and Miss Allison Meyer, helping out to create a training and an application for students to get involved. For the returning 7th and 8th graders this year, they could apply last year to get one of those spots. And we had the training before the school year started, and it's a club, so we meet once a week after school to plan different challenges and different activities to build that restorative culture among their peers and to provide a support for their teachers. as well. A couple years ago, I asked the principal, every month we have something called family meeting. So again, I want to highlight that Skinner really makes an effort with our language. So we don't call it like a grade level assembly, even though that's what it is. We call it family meeting because we're coming together as a Skinner family by grade level once a month. And we use that time to really celebrate students, go over any sort of announcements that need to happen per grade level, but use the majority of time to celebrate students with attendance and celebrate kindness and academic achievement as well. And so, so a couple years ago, I realized this was a great opportunity for restorative practices to be talked about. And so I asked the principal for 5 minutes for a restorative practices time. And she graciously gave it to us. I didn't know what that was really going to look like, but it turned into monthly challenges. So at the beginning of the school year, we would do things like give 5 new people a high five. What's really great this year is because we have this student-led group, they're now in charge of creating the restorative challenges for family meeting. And so they came up with this idea to have a leaf of kindness to go along with the fall theme. And the leaf of kindness says, "You are awesome, pass it on." And we showed a short video of how kindness can really have a ripple effect. In this video, someone sees someone being really kind to a stranger, and then that inspires them to be kind. And so each Restorative Justice League member had a leaf of kindness to pass out to someone they didn't know that they saw being kind. And then it would be a ripple effect of like, then if you get the leaf of kindness, you get to pass it on to someone. So using that time to talk about restorative practices so that everyone at Skinner is getting the opportunity to learn what restorative practices is and what that can look like as we build community, and having that be student-led work as well. And then community building circles, we're really pushing circles at Skinner and making sure we're not just using them as an intervention, but that we use it preventively and building that community, because we know that's the strength of restorative practices, is building that community. So we'll push in as restorative practice coordinators to help facilitate those circles for teachers that want some help in that. Especially at the beginning of the year, setting up that classroom culture and making sure that everyone feels included, feels safe, and feels a part of something, because we know that's when we're doing restorative the right way. Being a restorative practices coordinator, there's also intervention. And so we have a radio that we love so much that goes off if any teacher needs support in their classroom with a student or a situation. And so again, we're trying to push into the classroom as much as possible instead of sending kids out. That's a year-long strategy, and like something that we really believe in is making sure we're not sending kids out. But again, for the first month, that's really what we're pushing to do. With that, we know that restorative practices can be challenging to have a restorative conversation when you're a teacher and you have a class of 35. So we've offered to support by coming to cover classes. So not just coming to have a restorative conversation with the student, but if the teacher or staff member really wants to have a restorative in real time, but has 34 students and wants to make sure they're like giving their full attention to the situation, then we can come and cover the classroom so they can have that conversation in the hallway or in a different space so that it can happen in real time and not have to wait until a planning or lunch period. Again, there are still the more formal mediations and circles in response to students advocating for help, staff members advocating, seeing a need and bringing it together. I included a pie chart of our data from September of our numbers of where the issues, like who was asking for help. What was really nice is that the vast majority of people asking for help were the students themselves or peers, like letting us know about a situation or someone needing help, or the teachers asking for support. It was pretty rare that something happened and then we needed to intervene after the fact. So we've built a culture. If you see something, say something here at Skinner. And we go over at the beginning of the year the difference between snitching, which is just trying to get someone in trouble, versus like advocating and like trying to help someone because you don't want them to be in trouble. So that's a big push so that we can make sure that we're offering support to people who need it. But we know also as adults, we don't know everything happening in the building. And so building that culture of students seeking support if they notice they need help themselves, or if a classmate might need some help as well. Point sheets is an intervention we have for those high flyer kids that need some extra support. It's a half sheet that students get from their learning family in the morning that have some 3 to 4 goals, being positive even if redirected, finishing classwork, things like that. That would basically, if they met all those goals, that would mean they had a solid day. And so support staff and as a restorative practices coordinator, I manage the point sheets for my grade level, so for the 7th grade, so that I can use lunchtime and after school to check in with kids and see how their day is going. If they don't make their points, checking back in to see what went wrong in the day, circling back with if they had a tough day in math and got really low points where they weren't meeting those daily goals, seeing if we can get caught up academically, do something to do any sort of repairing with the classroom or with the relationship with the teacher so that we can have a great day the next day. And then the last thing in terms of a typical week in the life of a restorative practice coordinator at Skinner would be after school intervention. Every support staff team member has 1 day a week that we are in charge of holding after school intervention. Every intervention we have here at Skinner, we try to make as restorative as possible. So the idea isn't that if a student messes up and they have ASI, then they have to sit and be shamed after school and think about what they've done. And we're really trying to make it an active time where they can actively bring positivity to the community. So for example, a student had a really rough time in their language arts class and like had to reset and then came back in and threw papers everywhere. We would use that time after school to circle back with the teacher, check in, see what was going on beforehand, and then try to come up with really creative solutions so that we can be thinking about the future and making sure we have all the tools in place so that the relationship is repaired, and helping clean up the room or seeing if there's anything the teacher needs to try to bring a positivity back into the community before the next class would be the goal. And so that's kind of a typical week in the life of what a restorative practices coordinator does at Skinner Middle School.
I have a question for you, Ms. Horton.
Yes.
How much time do you spend at your desk?
Ooh, not too much. Especially if I'm noticing, the thing that keeps me at my desk the most is logging the what I'm doing so that we have that data, myself and the other RPC, make sure we track every student that is coming up. So we do have that data of like, is the student coming to us? Are we hearing this about the peer? That's the one thing that kind of ties me down to my desk, and also making sure we're contacting home to loop in family members so they know the restorative process, so they know what's going on in their student's life. Those are the 2 main things that keep me at my desk. Otherwise, we want to push out as much as possible. So I would say not very often am I at my desk unless I'm with a student in my office.
Awesome. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what the role might look like at the district level. And so again, kind of thinking about those 3 categories of driving district culture, proactive relationship building, and then supporting schools around interventions. You'll see from the chart on the screen that I'm very fortunate that after 13, 14 years of implementation in Denver Public Schools, we are finally at a place where I do feel like I spend about 50% of my time driving school culture. Tim Turley, my counterpart here in the district, when he originally started in this role, we did not have the luxury of school-based coordinators. And so Tim would frequently drive around throughout all of the, I think, 180 some schools at the time in Denver Public Schools, and was only doing interventions. And so this has been a really big shift for us, and it's great to see how the role has evolved. And so we'll start a little bit around that driving district culture piece. Denver Public Schools is frequently looked to as a national model for restorative justice practices, but that does not mean that we don't have a lot of learning and growing to do. And so there's a couple things in our district that we're doing this year. Some of them are old, some of them are new, but we are always trying to grow and help make sure that that understanding of what it means to be restorative transcends our team and our school-based coordinators. And so one thing that I spend a lot of my time doing is monthly training. And so we have a variety of training opportunities within our district. This year we are rolling out a 3-tiered training approach, and we completely stole that from Oakland Unified School District when we heard about their training model after a visit out there last year. And so Oakland Unified has been training people using a lot of that multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS or RTI language, talking about behaviors and thinking about our students and our school culture as far as tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And so we offer, the idea behind MTSS is that tier 1, those are those universal supports that you provide for all students, and those will work for about 80% of students most of the time. And so we wanted to make sure that our training mirrored that. And so we offer a 1-day training called Relate that is entirely relationship building strategies. We also offer on a monthly basis Repair, and that is the tier 2 training. And so Repair, or tier 2, I should say, in the MTSS world are those targeted interventions that about 15% of our students need to stay on track. And to continue to meet expectations and to be successful. And so that 2-day repair training really focuses on what those targeted interventions are. And so this year we're experimenting with new training, and we kind of have blended together restorative practices with some nonviolent communication and motivational interviewing strategies. And it ranges from everything as like how you can frame redirects in a way that is more restorative to formal conferencing and what that would look like in a school setting. We even talk about systems and how you can analyze systems to see if they are actually supporting your students, or if rather they're making it so easy to refer your students that it's becoming overwhelming for the discipline team within the building. We also to give some strategies for folks to use when they are feeling like they're in that intervention mode, how to switch and take advantage and I guess look at the conflict through a different lens to see how they can then start being preventative in the future to prevent that from happening more often. And then finally, we offer Reintegrate, which is our tier 3 training. And Reintegrate is to provide intensive supports for our students. And so a lot of that has to do with what processes you use when you're welcoming either a student or an adult back into your school community after a time away. And we also talk about in that training how to integrate someone into your school culture who might be new to it at an odd time in the school year. And so some of the things we actually haven't piloted that training yet, but some of the things that we hope to cover in there is when you have students that are out maybe for a suspension, maybe you just have a student who is out of class for 15 minutes. What are some of the strategies that you can use as a school or as a teacher in order to make that student feel welcomed and supported when they return? We also offer monthly cohort meetings for all of our school-based restorative practices coordinators. And so those rotate throughout a couple different locations in the district, and our coordinators actually get to vote on the topics that will be covered. And typically what those meetings look like is we spend about 15 minutes building community, and so typically an icebreaker, depending on the amount of people that we have in the room and what we can manage. We spend about 30 to 45 minutes. I usually do a training around a specific implementation strategy. So for example, some of the topics of our webinars are actually some of our implementation strategies. So gaining staff buy-in, authentic ways to really engage our families, data collection, and sometimes even just how to navigate the internal systems of Denver Public Schools. It's a large district, and some of our school-based coordinators are sometimes really unfamiliar with some of those larger systems and structures. And then sometimes it's something really concrete, like how to plan a professional learning session for the teachers in your school. Those are offered every month, and they're about 2 hours long. And after we do the implementation strategy, we make sure that our coordinators have time to connect with other coordinators that work with students of a similar age level. And so we have our elementary cohort, a middle school cohort that Allison Horton kindly leads for us, and a high school cohort. And so they get to take whatever implementation strategy we discussed and figure out how it meets the needs of those students for their specific age level. I also spend a lot of time training in schools. And so our school buildings can request training for all staff. And so a lot of times those are either before school or after school times. They're usually very short on time. And so I've had training requests for everything from 30 minutes to 4 hours if I'm very lucky. And typically what I'll do there is just focus on one strategy. And so we're never going into a school at that level and training folks in community building circles. It's usually like a very isolated strategy. So maybe icebreakers or how to have a restorative conversation. And even those can be really tricky with managing time. I do a lot of work with school systems analysis. So in addition to providing training, I take calls from buildings who request support. And a lot of times that support is, we've been having a lot of issues around this behavior. Can you come and check out our systems to see if the systems we have are actually supporting restorative mindset and skill building within our young people, or if we've actually created systems that are a disservice to our school community and specifically to our students. So I would say typically I'm in buildings maybe once or twice a week, just conducting observations. So for example, this morning I spent about 4 hours at a school giving some feedback on some of the systems they had set up that were allowing for their RP coordinators to only be used as firefighters. I do a lot of tool and resource development. Some of the resources that have been shared along with these webinars over the last year are some good examples of that. But if I'm in a building and I'm hearing, it would be really useful if I had something like this, I'll typically create a district version of that and send them out to folks so they can edit to make them work for their specific school community. So a couple examples I can give, some resources that we've shared in the past on webinars have been scripts for calling home, both preventatively to build relationships with families and also when you're calling home about a specific behavior or a specific incident. The rubric I mentioned that we use for coaching our restorative practices coordinators. Recently, we developed something called a behavior support follow-up form, which is something that if a student is sent down to an office or works with a support staff member in a school building, it's a quick tool that the support staff member and the student can fill out together that the student then brings back to the class as their pass, as a way to communicate with teachers what happened while they were out of the room. So those are just a couple examples of some of the tools and resources that I've developed for our district. And then finally, I have the pleasure of being able to keep circle once a month for our district office staff. Denver Public Schools is both blessed and cursed that restorative practices is in our discipline matrix. It's wonderful to have that be the only named intervention in our discipline matrix, but it also means that that's frequently how folks are introduced to the idea of being restorative. And so a lot of people in our district only see restorative practices as an intervention and something that is done to students. And so we are trying to do some work proactively at our district to really change people's minds about what it means to be restorative. And also just, it is hard to be an educator, whether you are in the classroom or whether you're at the district level. And so some of it is just for wellness as well. But we've been keeping circle about once a month for folks that work at the district office so that they can really understand what it means to be restorative. The next kind of major chunk of how I spend my time is building proactive relationships. And obviously that looks a little different at the district level than it does at the schools. I probably still compliment people on their shoes and their new haircuts, but frequently those are adults that I'm complimenting. And so Denver Public Schools, it's a large district. We serve 92,000 students and have a pretty large central office. And so some of the work that I have to do is just networking with the other departments in our district. And so some examples I can give of folks I try to connect with frequently. We have a culture and equity department at our district. And so I work really closely with them so that we can always make sure that we are speaking the same language when we're out in buildings. Denver Public Schools recently started a trauma-informed department. And so same thing, I reached out to the 3 women that were just hired to lead a lot of the work around trauma-informed practices in Denver Public Schools, and invited them to attend our restorative practices training to ensure that we were using the same language when we're out in buildings. We know that our philosophies align, but it's very different to actually be able to borrow language and to refer someone to a training knowing what it is versus saying just like, here's a flyer, I've heard this exists. I do a lot of networking with our principals as well. And so attending events where I know principals are going to be, or even just building discipline leaders. So that might be a dean or an assistant principal, so that I can start to connect with folks. And by connecting with people and building those relationships up front, I usually I'm more likely to be invited into a systems analysis versus coming out to put out a fire that's happening in a school. I try to be very visible at events, even those that are not explicitly connected to restorative justice practices. And so that includes like those building discipline leader meetings, some other I'll try to attend. For example, tomorrow we have a training on how to handle issues of discrimination in our district. And so I'll be present at that event as well, just because I know there will be a lot of people who I want to know my face, and I want them to know who I am and what my role is. And so I spend a lot of time kind of inviting myself to meetings, or finding out things are going on and just knowing that I need to be visible. I do a lot of work around streamlining our communication around restorative practices. So a lot of times in buildings, for example, they'll have a blurb about restorative practices in a handbook somewhere. And so I'll be able to give some feedback to them about how they might want to word that differently. We have been working on rewriting some pieces of our discipline matrix recently. And so supporting with making sure that the way we're messaging restorative practices gets us away from thinking that restorative justice practices are just an intervention. And then this year I'm trying to do a lot more of this, but celebrating the good things that are happening in our schools. I think so often we talk about what can be improved upon and what can we work on, but it's celebrating the wonderful things that are happening that can really help with some buy-in and commitment and make some people feel more valued within our district. And so this year we're hoping to start a monthly newsletter where we'll be highlighting things that myself and Tim, our other district coordinator, have seen in buildings that are going well, because I think so often we just shine a light on things that aren't going well. And then last but not least, from an intervention perspective, there are a couple things that I'll do sometimes in schools. And like I said, I feel very fortunate that that piece of my pie chart is looking pretty small. But sometimes I'll be observing or keeping a circle in a classroom. A lot of times we'll get requests from a principal about, I have this 3rd grade classroom and it's kind of getting off the rails and the teacher needs a lot of support. And so there are even days where I've spent a whole day in one classroom and really just worked on relationship building and community building with that educator and those students. Occasionally I'll be facilitating conferences or keeping harm circles for complicated incidents. One example I can give recently was I had we have a shared campus model here in Denver Public Schools where sometimes we have 2 buildings on one campus. And sometimes those are buildings that are almost directly competing with one another for enrollment numbers. So you can imagine things get very tense. But I recently facilitated a conversation between principals from 2 schools that were on a shared campus. So you could imagine that would be a very complicated thing for either of those schools' school-based coordinators to lead, since either one of them would be their supervisor or their boss. And so sometimes I'll be brought in for incidents such as that. Sometimes if a school has something that's really complicated where they don't really know to start, like it feels like there was so much harm to so many groups of people that they're really just struggling with an approach, I'll come in and do some consultation and then sometimes lead some of that as well if they need support as far as capacity goes. And so sometimes that might look like, I've had schools that had kind of social media emergencies, and we all know how quickly that can affect so many of our students and our families. And so working with the school to figure out what's a way that we can make sure that all of the students are authentically engaged in conversations about the impact that their behavior has had and how we can actually make next steps for repairing harm. And a lot of times it's just processing. So I'll do a lot of support around helping the students who are impacted, but not necessarily leaders of the behavior, really reflect and process on how they're feeling and how they can move forward. And then last but not least, and then this is what I try to do most often when I'm called out to a school building for intervention purposes, is either modeling, observing, or coaching our school-based coordinators to use those restorative interventions. And so one thing that I love about our district and the way that we hire coordinators is sometimes we hire folks who went to school for something around, like Allison Horton went to her school around these peace studies. We have some folks in some of our buildings who went to school for mediation. And then we also just have some community members who were hired for their ability to build relationships and connect with the students and families in that community. And so our coordinators enter with varying levels of skill, and we also kind of want to align our practices from building to building. And so sometimes I'll be called out when a coordinator has first started and they're kind of overwhelmed by these first couple incidents that are coming their way. And so I might model for them what I would do in that situation. And then we'll have a coaching and debriefing session afterwards. And then I'll usually come out one more time and observe them as they lead their first higher level restorative conference or harm circle, so that we can make sure that they're moving forward and feeling like they have the tools they need to be effective in their role.
There are definitely some challenges to the role as a restorative practices coordinator at the school level. Always making sure we're defining restorative justice and restorative practices has been key, because it can get so confused with just being an alternative to discipline. So at the beginning of this year, as the district is making sure we're trying to redefine and make clear what restorative practices is really about, and that's a community building piece. We wanted to do the same at Skinner, and so during restorative practice professional development time that we have at the beginning of the year before our students come back at Skinner, I asked the staff what's something that makes us a restorative school, and our staff were able to identify that we give kids second chances, we're building relationships, we're talking to kids, and some of those intervention type responses, but making sure that we were highlighting and defining that restorative practices is really about building community, so that we can celebrate the good and be able to take head on and come together with the not as good. And so highlighting the things we do at Skinner, like those language pieces I talked about earlier, calling things learning family and calling grade level assemblies family meeting, but also the events that we have at Skinner. We have something called Skinner Cares Day, where we spend 2 full days through in the school year simply just building community and traveling together in those learning family spaces to talk about if you really knew me statements, to really get to know one another and break down any barriers that we have, to talk about racism and bullying and issues that are affecting our students and our families and our community. So something like Skinner Cares Day wasn't mentioned as something restorative, but it's one of the most restorative things we do. So making sure that we're having those conversations as a staff of what restorative practices means to our building, and clearing up any confusion on what it means to be a restorative practices coordinator versus a dean versus a social worker. The number one challenge of restorative practices from all sides is definitely time. There's never enough time in the day, and with teachers' busy schedules of only having a certain amount of time for planning and having all these responsibilities, it can be tough to make sure we fit in those restorative conversations when something has happened, or even having the time to plan community building circles or proactive preventative interventions. To have that time can be tricky, but it's something we try to make sure that we do as much as possible, and dedicating so much time in those meetings to make sure our communication is strong with each other, and using every time that we have possible to build those relationships with kids, and utilizing things like hallway duty and morning duty and lunchtime to really make use of all the time we do have, because we know if we put in the work to build the community and build the culture at the beginning of the year, we can really reap the benefits of that throughout the year, as long as we keep coming back to it and strengthening the community. Something that Allison just shared, but that I also want to work on is remembering to share the success stories and strategies with all staff. So that celebration piece is really key. It can be great to see something happen of a really great restorative or students really stepping up. But if I'm just keeping that to myself, then we don't get to celebrate that as a school. And it's really a school that makes it a restorative building, not just having a restorative practices coordinator. So having the strength of so many different kinds of restorative work being done in the building at all times, making sure to share those successes and strategies with all staff. And then reminding educators that restorative practices aren't just a one and done. Some teachers come up to me and they're like, oh yeah, I tried that restorative practices with the student, but it didn't work. And so unpacking that and seeing, you know, was there follow through? If that didn't work, did we try again? And making sure that we don't see it as a one and done attempt, that if it doesn't work, then we're gonna go a punitive route, that we're always being open to restorative and creative solutions, because that's what our kids deserve.
At the district level, I mentioned before that our discipline policy is definitely a blessing and a curse. And in addition, just to the fact that it names restorative practices as an intervention, and that's typically the first time people are introduced to the idea of restorative practices when they enter a district. There are a couple other challenges that brings up, namely that it focuses on restorative practices as something that is done to students after they've done a certain behavior. And so that is really challenging, in that it also kind of robs of the spirit of restorative practices, that a restorative intervention should meet both the needs of the student who exhibited behavior and the folks or the adult and the folks who are impacted by the behavior. And so it really leaves out including the person who is impacted from the conversation. And so I do a lot of work in our buildings to say, like, it is so great that we have this discipline policy, but if that is the way that you're thinking about restorative justice or restorative practices, you're thinking too narrowly. I think one of the other challenges just operating in a large district is making sure that I'm included and our team is included in meetings across departments where our work overlaps. Things have a tendency to start happening in silos. And so I think that's one of my greatest challenges is, you know, as our district moves forward, for example, with this new trauma-informed initiative, making sure that that doesn't mean that restorative practices is being looked at as something different, but rather something that fits under that umbrella of being trauma-informed. And then last but not least, one of the challenges I frequently have is being seen as an additional support in our district rather than always being seen as this alternative. And so because the way that restorative practices has been rolled out, it's a lot of times I'll hear and see folks kind of looking at a situation or at a crisis and thinking, are we going to be restorative or are we not? And they kind of see restorative practices as this alternative. And so making sure that folks understand that, like, you can always be restorative in any situation, it might just look differently. And so an example I can give is we've had a couple of crises early on this school year in our district, unfortunately, and we have a district level crisis team that goes out to respond to those incidents. And so helping that team understand that restorative practices can be this ongoing support that we offer to these buildings after a crisis team has come in and worked for 2 days and left, versus sometimes we have folks that feel maybe like a little territorial about the role that they play, and they're unwilling to see restorative practices can actually be something that really supports you versus something that would take away your role in the district. And so I would say those are kind of the greatest challenges that we have at our district level, and we hope to mitigate those by just continuing to build relationships and improve the education that folks have in the district about what it really means to be restorative. And so that
right,
is today.
Thank you, Allison, for that presentation. So we are going to take questions now. So just as a reminder, if you can either type your question in the question box, which many of you are doing. If you are on the phone and not on your computer or smartphone, so you can actually see the presentation, then I can't call on you. I have no way of seeing you, so I can't unmute your line to take your question, but you can, and some of you are already doing this. You can email me your question. You should have my email address that you got when you're with your confirmation for the webinar, but if not, it's dnicole@advancementproject.org. For those of you who've been through our trainings and who know me personally, you can send me a text message and I will get your question answered that way. So just as a reminder, there are some tools already that Allison's mentioned that we will send out. The coaching tool rubric, the one-pagers on calling home. If you're ever interested in seeing Skinner Middle School and what Allison Horton does day-to-day up close and personal, you can go on our website, rjpartnership.org, and you can sign up for one of the visits that Skinner does host throughout the year. So our first question, and I promise this is not my question, is can you all define what circles are?
We're nodding at each other.
Yeah.
Let's go for it. So Allison and I have both been through the 4-day circle keeper training. And so one thing we try to be really mindful of is when we are training folks in using elements of circle, being really mindful of not labeling them as circle keepers. And so we try as a district, and again, just knowing that sometimes folks take things they've been trained in and run with it, and we don't necessarily know that's happening. But we try to be really mindful as a district that these circle keepers in our district are folks that have gone through a 4-day intensive training around circle keeping. As far as like training like classroom teachers in circle, we are frequently only training them in 1 or 2 elements of circle, and we're very clear about that in the process. And so I might be training a teacher in, or a group of teachers in icebreakers, or how to use a check-in round at the beginning of your class, but we are not naming them as circle keepers and telling them that they're keeping kind of like a full community building circle with all of the elements.
Allison, did you have anything to add? Allison Horton?
Yeah, I would just kind of piggyback off that. When we're doing circles at Skinner, they are not often the formal P circles, how 4 of our staff member were trained last year. But again, those elements of celebration or welcoming, also we had our Restorative Justice League students trained in elements of circles so that they could help the staff members, the teachers in their classrooms with that circle process. And so we had in one of our home ec classes, there was a kind of rough period where there was mixed grade levels, and so there were a lot of different students in there, and so the teacher wanted to have a circle just to get to know students, and then one of our Restorative Justice League members kind of jumped in after being having some of that background in 3 days of training to step in and talk about different elements of circles that he felt were missing that could have helped the classroom kind of talk about things that were going on and get to know each other in a deeper level. So it's been really nice to have that extra peer support of implementing and helping staff with circles when with those elements of circles so that it can be done with fidelity in their pieces.
Thank you both. And our project manager, our Restorative Justice Partnership project manager, Lindsay, recently did put together a one-pager that talked about circle training that we will be able to send out with the recording of this webinar as well, that we can also send out some definitions that might help you all who are thinking about incorporating circles in your practice. So this next question is for you, Allison Horton. What is your role with out-of-school suspensions and in-school suspensions?
That's a great question. So our support staff team really works together. And so if there's an in-school suspension, we call it in-school intervention here at Skinner. We're making sure that there's always a restorative element, again, because our deans are restorative as well. Sometimes that's led by me or Mr. Ventresca, the other RPC, and sometimes it's led by the deans just because they have the most information of the situation. But we make sure there's always a restorative element because they are being taken out of the community, and we want to make sure that there's processing and actions forward so they can come back into the community feeling good and accepted and included. and any sort of repair that needs to be done on adult side or student side, that making sure that that happens. So often I'll check in the in-school intervention room just to see who's in there or what's going on, and walk through the restorative questions of with the student to see if I can help in any way of getting them back to a place where they can reenter to the community. As far as out of school suspensions, they are pretty rare at Skinner. We really like to keep students at school, but there are safety issues that sometimes does occur that we have out of school suspensions. Again, it would be the same as in-school intervention, where we want to make sure that they have all the tools they need to come back into the community. So oftentimes if a student is out of school suspended, when they come back into school, they will have a reinstatement meeting with the family and with a restorative practices coordinator and a dean, but then also spend some time in school intervention so we can ease them back into the community, so that they're feeling some success and feeling, again, part of our community after being away. So as my role in a restorative practices coordinator, making sure that we always have a restorative element to those suspension moments.
Thanks, Allison. This next question is also Allison Horton. Can you talk about the staff makeup of Skinner? So mainly, what are the specific positions in administration? I mean, there's your role as a restorative practice coordinator. You've also talked about the dean. You also have the social workers. Can you talk about your admin staff positions and then your support staff positions in the school, what they are?
What they are. So let me make sure I understand the question. Like, so what admin and support staff positions we have at Skinner, or what they do?
No, just listing what positions exist.
Oh, okay. So we have a principal, an assistant principal. We have a full-time social worker. We have 2 deans. We have 2 restorative practices coordinators. And we have 2 social work interns that are here part-time. And then we have a drug preventionist that is also part-time.
And I think you missed full-time social worker. And Skinner actually has a unique situation right now with their administration, where they actually have an executive principal as well. And so Michelle Koyama, how long was Michelle principal here?
She was principal for about 9 years.
Michelle Koyama was principal of Skinner Middle School for 9 years. And this year she is executive principal over Skinner Middle School and then another middle school in the neighborhood. Just as a way to kind of transfer the wonderful school culture we've seen flourish here at Skinner to some other schools in the neighborhood that might require some additional support.
Thank you. Okay, Allison Horton, this one is for you again. What does Skinner use to track data regarding behavior and restorative intervention?
So myself and the other RPC use a tracker on a Google Sheets tracker, where we're tracking every student that we have that we meet with. This year, we're tracking if they're a student of color, and with a student with disability, or just student with disability or none, so that we can have that data as well. Last year, we realized we weren't tracking that whatsoever, and it was through the cohort meetings that Allison Meyer was leading that we realized we really need to be paying attention to that data as well. So we track the student, where the teacher or classroom, where the situation is coming from. Is it prevention or intervention? So again, we're tracking if it was brought to our attention. Are we seeing the student in front of us because they're self-advocating and asking for some support? Did a teacher bring this to our attention? Did a peer bring this to our attention? Did a support staff member sense an issue from rumors or observations and we pulled a student? Or did something happen and we intervened after the fact? So we're really trying to break down how we can see how much preventative work we're doing versus intervention work. And then we track the grade level and any sort of like next steps or what follow-up needs to happen. So that's something that's shared within support staff so that we can look at our restorative data. We keep changing it every year, a little by little, to see what kind of information is the most important, especially when we're thinking about sharing with all staff. And so that prevention and intervention piece of who's bringing that attention has been really nice to share with staff this year, as we try to make sure we're being proactive and not just fighting fires.
One thing I want to note that we're very fortunate to have as a district is we do have a district Google server. And so I know there are a lot of concerns around the student information not being secure, and we're very lucky that Denver Public Schools has a lot of protection around our Google Docs.
Okay, thank you. Allison Horton, I think this one is for you as well. What does it look like when you push into the classroom to either, one, respond to an incident, and two, build relationships?
It looks the exact same. It just would depend on where I'm sitting. So I'm walking into a classroom, and if I'm there as an intervention, so I'm there for a specific student, then I'm grabbing a seat next to that specific student. And if it's during instruction time, just like doing little quiet, like, oh, let's be on task, or like if it's a time where it's independent work or group work, checking in with the student to see what's going on, just to see how their day's going, kicking off with that instead of what's happening, I had to get called in here. So a soft approach and just checking in, and always asking that question of like, what do you need, and like, what support can I give? If I'm just there to visit, then I'm doing very similar things. It's just I have a little more freedom of where I might be sitting in the classroom, or walking around a little more to interact with more students. Again, just to really push so that it's normal for a support staff member to be in the classroom. It's not seen as anything abnormal or something to give much attention to. And it goes pretty well. Sometimes there can be, you go into a classroom and people are like, oh, hey, Miss Horton, like, what's going on? But a lot of times, as soon as I'm sitting down, students are forgotten about me and are focused back on the lesson or whatever is going on at their table. So checking in with students and walking around and literally doing the work with them. So I was in a math class this morning because I needed to pre-conference with the student. But when I went in, the teacher was in the middle of their do now and then went straight into a mini lesson. So I sat there and worked on my 7th grade math skills and did that until it was a good time to pull the student into the hallway to pre-conference for a restorative that would happen later in the day.
A couple tools we've been developing at the district level that can help support, and actually this was inspired by a need that Allison Horton and a teacher coach here brought to us, was that sometimes when they're in the classroom just proactively, they wish that they had some sort of tool that they could use to give the teacher feedback. And so I'd be happy to share with Juana so she can share with everyone on this webinar an early draft of a tool we're working on that'll be a restorative classroom rubric. And so a restorative practices coordinator that's just in classrooms observing would at least be able to leave the teacher with some feedback for what they saw. And so a lot of it is very relational based. And so what are some signs that you see of relationships among students or relationships between teacher and student? One of the reasons we were most excited about the tool is it really highlights some things that you never really see highlighted in a formal teacher evaluation. And so one of my favorite indicators on the tool, for example, is in the classroom, did you see that students were able to be their own age? And so a lot of times you create these expectations in classrooms that actually don't celebrate the fact that it's full of 12-year-olds. And 12-year-olds have certain skills and those should be celebrated in a very different energy. And so little things like that to really talk about more of the spirit of the classroom and what the coordinator saw. When I'm coaching some of our newer restorative practices school-based coordinators on what it looks like when they're called to a classroom for an intervention, I frequently start to give them some language they can use for teachers to maybe code what the request is when a restorative practices coordinator comes to intervene. And so I was working with a school today where we were talking about coding it 1 through 4. A 1 would be if they want you to come and just cover the class so the teacher can step out and have that hallway conversation. A 2 would be if they just need an extra adult in the rooms for while things get calm. And so that might be that situation where you're sitting next to a specific student or a particular group of students. A 3 might be if the teacher would like you to observe them having one of those hallway conversations and give feedback. And a 4 would be if the teacher needs you to model the conversation and then the teacher watches and they're getting ready to start facilitating their own conversations. And so we've kind of been using those 2 tools and models as a way to help our restorative practices coordinators know what to do then when they get to the classroom.
Great, thank you. Just as a reminder for everyone, we do, in addition to sending out the recording and all materials, we also do send out a copy of the presentation as well. So this next question is for both of you. Is part of your role addressing disproportionate discipline? And if so, how are you doing that? And I guess specifically for Allison Meyer, a second question, are you collecting data on this for each school?
Sure, so I can start with that. And I'm realizing that that was not explicitly in our presentation, and that might be because it is something that is so ingrained in Denver Public Schools. And so the department that my position is housed in is called the Student Equity and Opportunity Department. And we are never just looking at ISS and OSS numbers across the district without looking at them disaggregated. This year we've been paying a special attention. We've always paid a lot of attention to our students with disabilities and then separately to our students of color. And this year we've been paying a lot of attention to the overlap. And so our students with disabilities who are also students of color and what the data has been for those students. And I wish I had those numbers fresh with me right now, but I do not. But that is something that I could share. And we not only, when we are talking about discipline, we not only look at the in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension numbers, but we also spend a lot of time looking at academic achievement and really understanding where that's overlap. And so if our students of color with disabilities are being highly over-suspended in our school buildings, we also are looking at academic performance because that is the data that is most valuable sometimes when we're talking to folks on the instructional side of our district. And so being able to advocate for the impact that out of school and in school suspension has on student learning has been really powerful. As far as reviewing data for specific schools, definitely I have some counterparts in the district that lead our discipline work, and they are monitoring that on a weekly basis and then flagging schools. So if they see a certain school that has a high number of OSS or even a high number of OSS specifically for Black students or for Latino students, they will flag that and often will create a coordinated response between the discipline side and the restorative side. As a district, our goals for schools is that schools out of school suspension numbers are from 0 to 3% of their student population by the end of the year. And so we track that on a weekly and monthly basis. And so we kind of flag any school that is suspending more than 3% of their student population out of school. In addition to that, we also track 3% of students of color. And so any school that's suspending more than 3% of their students of color, and then any school that's suspending more than 3% of their students with disabilities. And so that kind of sends off a flag for us at the district, and we start to plug in a plan to support them.
At the school level, something Skinner started doing last year is putting in data of our academic achievement and breaking that down by race and also students with disability to show that we are definitely not where we need to be in terms of our academic achievement and where we need to put some more of our efforts. That was the first time we put that in our weekly, we call it staff news. So instead of having an all staff meeting once a week, that it's coming in a newsletter form or like a email form. And so having those numbers every week was really helpful. Again, as I mentioned, in the RP tracker, the restorative practices tracker that myself and the other RPC keep, we have a column that is dedicated to, is this a student of color? Is this a student of color with a disability? Is it a student of color? Is it a student with a disability, or is it none? That's something that is new this year because we realized that we should really be looking at that data more than just at the halfway point of the school year or the end of the school year, that should be a conversation that's happening more often. And so that's where that update and edit came from.
Okay. What are your strategies for eliminating racial bias in discipline practices? Do you offer cultural competency for teachers in your restorative justice training?
So one thing that's just interesting in being in a district this big is that we have multiple departments that are kind of taking that initiative on from different perspectives. And so we certainly talk about bias in our restorative practices trainings that, and particularly the ones that folks come to us to attend versus the ones that we are out in schools facilitating. And so we do a lot of work around we use a ladder of inference as the tool. And so we talk a lot about how our brain selects data and how we begin to make assumptions. And then our assumptions start to kind of reinforce our previous assumptions. And then next thing we know, we're kind of in this reflexive loop. And so we do a lot of, it's a lot of personal work for people, but that is a big part of the 2-day repair training that we do. That being said, our district is really fortunate to have an entire department that is our culture and equity leadership team. And there's a couple individuals in that department that specifically go out to schools and lead trainings on implicit and explicit bias. There's been a lot of equity work that's coming out of our trauma-informed practices. And so that's kind of at the district level where we're seeing a lot of the equity training. And then I know Skinner has done some work specifically with their staff.
Yeah, Skinner, every year when we're kicking off again during that green week before the students come in, where the staff at Skinner come together, we always have some sort. We've had microaggression training. We've had different discussions over what we're bringing to our classrooms and making sure that we are always keeping that lens in mind. We just recently had a staff meeting where we were breaking down. We have 3 celebrations a year where if students achieved something, like it's different for each celebration, but the first celebration is if students did their summer homework, they get to go to this celebration where they get ice cream and go to bouncy things, castles, and like there was a bouncy wrecking ball, all sorts of things, but like fun party type things. If they do their summer homework, they get a go. And so we had a long discussion as a staff where we are noticing year after year that during these celebrations, our students of color are staying back and our white students are going outside and celebrating. And it seems like it's an obvious division. And so if we are noticing that, we need to be doing something about it instead of it's still happening. And so in everything that we're doing at Skinner, making sure that we're always questioning ourselves and always making sure that we're being equitable. And so having those tough conversations and hearing staff input to make sure that we're not just trying to be more equitable, but that we're getting to be equitable. Yeah.
One other thing to note that I know Skinner has done and a couple other schools have done are book studies. And so what is Whistling Vivaldi? Skinner recently read, was it this year or last year?
This summer, yeah.
This summer, every staff member at Skinner was given the book Whistling Vivaldi as a way to start reading about bias and stereotypes and how those, is it school specific or I actually haven't read the book?
Yeah, it goes into schools and other spaces.
Got it.
From the author's perspective.
So we've seen a couple of our schools kind of selecting texts that they can then use to kind of facilitate those conversations with staff members. Some that we offered to a small cohort of schools last year were culturally responsive teaching in the brain. I can't remember the name of the other one. The rest of the libraries. For white folks who teach in the hood and the rest of y'all too. And actually there's a couple schools in DPS right now who are doing that as a book study as well.
Okay, I think we have about 3 or 4 more questions. I'm sorry, folks. I know we're at our time, I want to make sure we get these last questions answered. How have you been able to support people in shifting their mindset to see restorative justice as a philosophy to live by, as opposed to a program to
Do you want to start from a school-based level?
Yeah, I think that we've been doing, we've had restorative practices and we've had a restorative practices coordinator at Skinner for 11 years now. So this has been definitely a growing process. I've been here for 5 of those 11 years. But we know that there still aren't 100% buy-in from all staff, but we see those moments of them, of staff really believing in restorative, when they have those experiences where relationships are rebuilt and there's an action attached to it. I think that restorative practices can kind of get a bad rep because it's like, oh, you just say sorry and then the student is back to whatever it was. And so making sure that we know that that's not restorative, because that hasn't built community, and it's just taught someone, oh, if you say sorry, then that's somehow fixing something, but really taking the time and effort to build those relationships. We have a low staff turnover here at Skinner because it really does have a family feel here among staff and among with the students. And so building on that's coming from a restorative. So again, defining restorative practices, that's restorative practices, is that we've been able to build community within our staff members and within our school culture. And so highlighting that, so it's not seen as something that's, again, like some alternative to what a teacher is trying to do, that speak to their humanness, and then making sure that they remember the humanness of a 12-year-old and them being a 12-year-old, to build that insight, to make sure that they are that they believe in the restorative culture because of the benefits of it.
I would say at the district level, the training that we've rolled out this year has been really helpful. Kind of just emphasizing that relationships are the basis of restorative practices. And so just taking the time to develop a full one-day training on relationships that most folks are encouraged to attend before they attend any of our other trainings. Also, when I go out to a school site, just being really firm, and I will start with your school and starting with building relationships before I get to a point where we start about responsive practices. And then to support our coordinators in schools and shifting that mindset as a school level, I think a lot of the tools that we've developed has been really helpful, and namely that coaching rubric that will be shared, just because especially if we define that one person's job as more than being an interventionist, it helps folks see that the restorative practices itself, restorative justice itself, is not just an intervention.
Okay. Do you have hard data that restorative justice practices reduces disproportionate discipline? What results have you seen?
Denver Public Schools actually has not necessarily seen a decrease in the disproportionality. And so I do have some data that I can share from a small cohort that we worked really intensely with last year, and I will share that with Dwana following the webinar, where we did start to see some more success around reducing the disproportionality. I would say reducing though, and not eliminating. One thing we've seen as a district in the 12-ish years of implementation of restorative practices is that while overall out of school suspensions and in school suspensions have decreased, the disproportionality between our white students and our students of color, and also our students without disabilities and our students with disabilities, we have seen that the disproportionality continues to persist. And so at the district level, we're doing a lot of work about what are those restorative practices should reduce disproportionality. And if they are used with fidelity, and if people are honestly looking at the humanity in a person and understanding the individual nature of every situation. And so we are doing a lot of work on our end around fidelity this year, including going out to schools and kind of checking the status of implementation in each of our buildings. If you asked any building in DPS if they do restorative practices, they would all say yes, but that looks so different from one building to the next. And so at our level, we're really trying to do a status of what the fidelity of implementation is. And we're still kind of developing that process. I would say then there's also, we are looking at we are doing a lot of work to see how we can plug in those other departments to help support us. And so specifically that culture and equity department, how can we use their trainings as a way to complement and support restorative practices training, because clearly we still have folks coming in with a lot of biases.
Okay. Alice Meyer, you mentioned, I'm sorry, Allison Horton, did you want to respond to that question?
Can you say the question one more time from a school lens?
Do you have any hard data to show that restorative justice practices reduces the disparities that we see in discipline?
I would say that we have the numbers of over, again, the 11 years of our suspension numbers going down, and we know that that means then all of our students are spending more time in school and learning, but that, again, to kind of mirror what is happening in the district, it doesn't mean that the disproportionality has gone away at Skinner. And so making sure that we're collecting that data and looking at that data at a consistent time, so that that's always in our topic of conversation to make sure that we're addressing the disproportionality.
Okay, thank you. All right, Allison Meyer, you mentioned previously that you had spent a day in a classroom building relationships. What did that look like?
Sure. So I think I spent a day in a 4th grade, 5th grade classroom. And so this teacher's content, I believe it was, well, this was more than a year ago. It was she taught math, and she had 4th graders all morning up until lunch, and then she had 5th graders all afternoon. And so it essentially came down to 2 half days, just with 2 different groups of students. One thing that happens a lot with our coordinators when they're called into classrooms to support at a school level, and then again to us at a district level, is that frequently we're called into classrooms where students had never sat in circle before. And so I incorporated a lot of elements of circle, but these students, this was not the time to just also introduce a really new practice to them. And so we started off with an opening and an icebreaker and a check-in round. And then we kind of shifted to some written reflections. Students were able to give feedback on how they felt their classroom was doing, upholding their classroom expectations. And for 4th and 5th graders, to give them that opportunity to give a grade to their class was very fun for them. And so they were able to grade their class and do a kind of written reflection and share in small groups how they felt that the class was doing on expectations. Typically when I'm in those spaces, I use a pretty similar model, and as far as the questioning goes, although it'll vary whether or not students are used to sitting in circle, whether I use circle as the format, or if maybe we do more small group or individual work. And that format is typically, I want this year to be blank, or I want this class to be blank, and students fill in the blank. Then I have students say, what do you need from your teacher in order for this class to be blank? Then what do you need from your peers in order for this class to be blank? And finally, what do you need to do yourself in order to make this class blank? And that model is something that I use fairly frequently if I'm called into a specific classroom. And so looking back on this classroom I was in, my class would be blank. Students wrote their answers on Post-it notes, and we all kind of shared them and stuck them up. And then we're going to take a break, and we're going to do a brain break or an icebreaker activity before we jump into what you need from your teacher. I find when I'm in classrooms doing a reset like that, it's really helpful for the classroom teacher to have something, and the students to have something tangible afterwards. And so for that teacher following this classroom reset, we were able to give her the vision that her class has, and she participated as well, but the vision that our class has for what the year looks like, specifically requests that they made from what they need for her, things that they promised that they would do for one another, and then individual commitments that students made.
Okay, thanks. Allison Meyer, this is our last question, and it is for you. And it's a more logistical question about like your actual position. So it's a few questions and one big question. How many hours a day do you work? Are you under a contract with a school district? And have you done many family student circles?
Okay. So I would love to say I work 8 hours in a day, but I know that's not true. I would say I can keep to a 50-hour week on a good week. One of the things that's really interesting about supporting in schools is that so often when you shift to that preventative and building a school culture and away from being in a place where it's reactive, schools actually prefer for you to work with them before school starts or after the school day ends, if we're working on systems work or things like that, so they're not pulled away from their school communities. And so I would say frequently I start pretty early in the morning because a lot of times I'm meeting with principals or staffs before school even starts, maybe at like 7 or 7:30. And then a lot of times I'll work kind of later in the evening, especially when I'm working with some of our coordinators. Allison Horton and I meet fairly regularly, and I respect the boundaries that she sets on not having us meet to develop a tool during the middle of the school day when she wants to be able to be at lunch with her students and pushing into classrooms. And so we'll frequently meet at like 4 or 4:30 when things have wrapped up. And then in the middle of the day, it's also nice for me because then I can go out to schools and be conducting the observations and the systems analysis that I like to do. I am a district employee, although my counterpart in the district is contracted. So he's been leading this work for 12 years and was originally brought on as a contract employee and kind of maintained that status. Just last year is when my position was added. We actually had a grant through the Colorado Department of Education, and so I was brought on. However, it was with the commitment from the school district that when the grant ended, they would continue to fund my position. So as of this August, my position is now fully funded by Denver Public Schools. My counterpart is retiring at the end of this school year, and so I was kind of brought on as his succession plan, and already we're in conversation with our department managers around ensuring that, we've really started to build this model where now we have 2 district coordinators and we have 210 schools, and it would be wonderful to be able to continue that. So we are hoping that our district decides to, you can never replace Tim, but they decide to replace that position and continue to fund a second restorative practices district coordinator, but that is uncertain at the time. And then the last question about family and student circles, I would say that is something that I'm frequently brought in for because it kind of meets that level of like, this feels too complicated for some of our school-based coordinators. And so once it starts to evolve, people who they might not have relationships with or people outside of school buildings, I frequently will be called in. I would say the model I typically use is that coordinator then shadows me through that process, or someone in the building, if the building doesn't employ a coordinator, follows me through that process so that they might feel better equipped next time to work with it. I would say a lot of times it's false apprehension on the part of the school of feeling like families aren't going to embrace this work. And I have very rarely experienced a family who didn't embrace this approach. And so I've even done some conferences between like families who had older siblings who fought and then middle siblings who fought, and now it's the youngest siblings that are fighting. And so often families are just so relieved because this might actually be the first time that they were allowed to sit down together and really have this conversation. And so just modeling for folks the amount of pre-work it takes when you're going to bring people together who are also unfamiliar with the process. And yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you both. And I think Allison Horton has our closing for us today.
I do. This is from Sonia Johnson, a Euro-American feminist, social activist, and writer, from Going Out of Our Minds, The Metaphysics of Liberation. It's called We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. We don't need someone to show us the ropes. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Deep inside us, we know the feelings we need to guide us. Our task is to learn to trust our inner knowing.
So I just want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Again, we will send out the recording of the webinar, the resources, reference, and the slides within a week. You can find a recording of our previous webinars, with the exception of our one on community labor partnerships that has not been posted yet, on our website. which is rjpartnership.org, where you can also find a schedule for the school year for visits in case you want to meet Allison Horton and Allison Meyer in person and tour one of the schools in Denver that have been implementing restorative justice. Thank you both, Allison Horton and Allison Meyer, for your time.
Thank you, Dwana.
Thank you.
And we look forward to speaking with you soon. Our next webinar will be on restorative justice implementation and trauma. And as Allison Horton mentioned, please join us in the new year where we will have a full webinar on Skinner's Restorative Justice League, how that got started, and what how the training has been going, and what some of the results we have seen since its implementation. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a good night.